So today, we are going to go over the GMAR Addendum AC with the additional contingencies. And I'll say that this actually, I don't know how much people are using the Addendum AC anymore. This was drafted by the GMAR a little over a year ago in response to lots of different language that was floating around in terms of expanding on additional contingencies as it relates to writing in a competitive situation. So I think that now what I'm seeing more of, and I'm sure Joni is seeing the same things, is just people are like using this and maybe only checking one box or just taking the language from this and just incorporating it into the offer and the additional provisions versus using the addendum AC at all. But we just want to give you guys, especially our newbies, line of sight to this, and I'm sure you've seen it in your zip forms, packets, and just maybe not knowing what to do with it. So this is, again, kind of this addendum that was adopted by the GMAR to expand upon those contingencies and is a tool to use in competitive offer writing. So what its goal initially was to combine and create consistency across the marketplace. At the time that this was being developed, there was just a lot of different versions of kind of essentially the same language being floated around. We wanted to create consistency in the marketplace, so the GMAR just drafted this so that everybody could be on the same page. So it is optional use. Again, you're not going to be necessarily needing to use this if you're not writing in a competitive situation. Or if you are and don't feel the need, or your buyer does not want to expand on those contingencies, then you wouldn't necessarily need to use it. And as we'll see, and as I'll show you, if you want to, you can use all or parts of it as well. So just like any addendum. So again, it just might not even be something that you use, but we want you to know about it in case, again, it's just another tool in your toolbox. The three main points that it covers are the inspection contingency threshold, the appraisal gap language, and the escalation clause. And as we like to just kind of give a heads up, and maybe, this might have calmed down now. But at the time, what we were contending with too was just a difference of opinion on interpretation of some of this language. So kind of have this understanding that you might go into some situations where people might disagree with how it's interpreted, and know that's okay. Again, it's kind of like what we're battling with this commission and compensation and agreement conundrum, I'll say. Just like there's just like different ways of doing things, differences of opinions, differences of interpretation about what to do, and just know that not one way is wrong or the other, or one way is correct. There's just different ways of handling kind of the same different ways to get to the same. Yes, Joan.
I'd like to add, though, all of these that are drafted in these addendums are done by attorneys.
Oh, yes.
And although that there are other ways of doing it, some others may be drafted by a firm or they may be drafted by an agent, and stay away from those. If you're going to get anything, use the forms that are drafted by agents, because we as licensees can't draft such things.
Yeah, drafted by attorneys. Yep.
Right.
So
The attorneys, sorry.
and I think that And to expand on that, I think that our WRA attorney was the one of our WRA attorneys is the one who drafted this, so.
Right.
Um, and then just as a heads up too, um, there might be consultation needed with lenders regarding the appraisal gap, for example, and I'll expand upon that more when we get to that. And transactions, of course, are always case by case. A note about where to find the addendum AC. So it's in your global packets and it's right next to the GMAR addendum A, which is that third one. And then they're like labeled almost identically. So you kind of have to hover over it to see that it's the addenda AC. So, um, and this was adopted, yeah, February of 2023, which seems like a lifetime ago, but I guess it was only last year. It's funny, I have to just laugh with Joan about this because it's like when this came out, this is what we were,
Well,
so focused on, right? And then now it's the compensation and concessions, discussion. So anyway, always something.
yeah,
Um, okay. So then, beginning at the top, so it's the addendum AC to offer to purchase additional contingencies addendum. And this first part should all look familiar to you. You're gonna cite when the offer to purchase was dated, made by which buyer with respect to the property at, and you'll put in the address. Um, and Joan went over this last week when she was going over the addendum A and the addendum O and the addendum R. Same thing here. Provisions preceded by an open box are part of this addendum if marked such with an X. They are not if marked with an N, A, or left blank. And we will take this opportunity to say that if you're not going to be including a provision in any of the addendums that you use, it's just good practice to put an NA versus leaving it blank. I would always just put an NA. It helps to demonstrate later on, if you need to, that you have gone over that section and buyer chose not to include it. Okay, so the inspection threshold language. So the idea with this is, and I'll kind of reiterate this in a couple slides too. The idea with the inspection contingency threshold is that what the buyer wants to communicate to the seller is I want an inspection contingency. I'm going to give you the right to cure, and I'm going to let you know that if defects fall under a certain amount, I'm not going to come to you and ask for any requests in terms of inspection repairs. I'm not going to serve a notice of defects and try and get out of the deal, or put it in your court to determine whether or not you're going to let me out of the deal. So it's just kind of giving that seller peace of mind in a competitive situation, like, okay, they're going to have an inspection contingency, but I know that they're not going to ask for anything if repairs come under $5,000, let's say. So that's kind of the heart of what this expansion is. The way it reads, starting at line 8, and again, you would over here mark that with an X that you're going to include it. Buyer agrees not to submit any notice of defects or amendment for repairs, replacement, credit, or price reduction under the inspection contingency in the offer unless the cumulative estimated cost to repair or replace the defects identified in the inspection exceeds blank. So, and this is where, excuse me. Oh, what happened? Here we go. So this is where you'll identify that amount. So, this is a conversation with a buyer. It could be 2,500, it could be 5,000, it could be 10,000. If a buyer really wants to just have an inspection for informational purposes only, they could make it really high and like $15,000 to $20,000, knowing that it probably won't get up that high. So it's really a conversation with the buyer in terms of what you would want to put in that line 10. But that's the dollar amount that you would identify as the seller, excuse me, the buyer, not requesting any amendment or proposing any amendment or submitting a notice of defects or replacement or credit if it falls under that amount. Moving on, if the seller has the right to cure defects. So that's another point to make, is you would only use this language if you're giving the seller the right to cure. Otherwise, it's completely unnecessary to use it if you're not giving the seller the right to cure. Continuing on, line 11, if buyer delivers the notice of defects, the seller's election to cure applies only to the balance of the items for which the cumulative cost to repair or replace exceeds the amount stated on line 10. I'm going to get to that in a minute. Estimates of costs of repair or replacement shall be obtained from independent qualified professional or contractors selected by the buyer. The seller agrees to provide access for buyer and sellers, seller agrees to provide access for buyer and buyer's qualified professional or contractors to obtain such estimates, and the buyer shall pay any costs associated with obtaining the estimate. So there's provisions for both buyer and seller within this. Seller is agreeing to give access, and buyer is agreeing to pay any costs associated. Parties may together agree on the cost to repair or replace the defects for purposes of this provision. The estimates obtained or agreed upon are utilized only for execution of this provision and do not affect any seller right to cure unless specifically agreed to in writing. Then there are additional provisions here that can be checked. So one or more of the following provisions may also be included if checked. The seller may also obtain estimates. So instead of just relying on the buyer may give permission to the seller that they can go ahead and obtain their own as well. They must deliver to the buyer by the deadline for the inspection contingency, if delivered before any notice of defects is delivered to the seller or buyer. So seller's kind of on a time crunch here, so they can get their own, but they have to deliver it before the inspection contingency deadline and deliver it before a notice of defects is delivered by the buyer. If the seller timely delivers such estimates, and the estimates differ from the buyer's estimates for the same items, parties agree they will average the different estimates for each affected item to arrive at the cost for the purposes of this provision. So it gets a little convoluted for sure. They have to spell it all out just in case these scenarios come up. And as a buyer's agent, I would say that, if you're writing in competition, I would probably go ahead and allow the seller to have and obtain these estimates. If you want to give them the best possible scenario, or the best possible scenario for the seller, I should say. Line 25, either party may extend the original deadline for the inspection contingency by 5 days to allow for follow-up inspections and obtaining estimates. Either party may do this by delivering written. So that's pretty nice. If that box is checked, that's saying that anyone, either the seller or the buyer, can just go ahead and extend the inspection contingency by 5 days just by delivering a notice. So parties do not have to agree upon it. If this box is checked, it can just be done with a notice, which is really nice, actually. So now I'm going to continue on. Line 9 uses the cumulative and adds an S to the defect. So, okay. So it can be used for one or more. So if one item is above the number on line 10, the notice could be given, or if all items add up to the number on line 10, the notice or amendment could be sent. So it's either or. So if you've got one item that rises above that threshold number, so let's say we're talking about a foundation issue, and that comes in above a $5,000 threshold that is named, that foundation repair, I should say, estimate comes in above that 5,000, then the buyer has the opportunity to serve a notice of defects or to serve an amendment first, offer an amendment first to the seller. And then it's also the case that if there are multiple items that, in of themselves, maybe they're $1,000 or $2,000, $3,000, that individually do not add up to that $5,000, that's fine. The cumulative cost of those items does fall over that $5,000 threshold and still could be used for this notice requirement, threshold requirement, I should say. So it's either or. Buyers agree not to send a notice or amendment if total costs fall under the threshold. Stated again. And then here's where I wanted to revisit lines 9 and 10. If seller elects to cure, seller will only be responsible for the cost to cure the defects over the threshold on line 10. So if the seller served a notice of defects and, we've got a $5,000 threshold and repairs total $15,000, if the seller elects to cure, then they're only on the hook for $10,000 of that, because we're now deducting that $5,000 from the total if the seller elects to cure. Again, this is only triggered if a notice of defects is served.
So that implies that the buyer has to pay the other side of the
Right.
balance. So he has to pay the $5,000. I mean,
And again, that's
it's
where it gets
implying
muddy.
he's agreeing to pay the $5,000 when the seller will cure the 15 or the
Right.
10, whatever.
So that's where it gets a little muddy, I think.
Yeah, that's
So-
where the questions come in.
Yeah, exactly. So I think what we'll say there too is if it ever gets to that scenario, you're going to come to us. And, we haven't had to field a lot of questions on the addendum AC in quite some time. So I'm just not quite sure how often people are using this provision anymore. And I just don't know. And if they are, it's never getting down to this kind of final step. So
Yeah, I haven't had a question for a long time.
yeah. And then conversational way to discuss this from Corey Lamont. So Corey Lamont is from the WRA, and she is the one who drafted this addendum AC. The language is intended to say that if the buyer includes $5,000 on line 10 and then provides a notice of defects for $10,000, the seller is only on the hook to cure $5,000. The buyer basically has said, I am good to cover $5,000. Anything above that, seller, I am saying I need you to cover. In some markets, it's referred to as the inspection gap. So you might hear this term being interchanged. That way, the seller knows the buyer isn't coming to them until the repairs hit a certain amount. Obviously, the sellers like this in a seller's market. This buyer should be very honest with themselves about the breaking point financially. So yes, these are all conversations that you're going to be discussing with the buyer as you write the offer. If you decide that this is something that you might want to use. Okay, any questions on that so far? What I think we want you guys to take away is just like the basic concept of it, right? Like, okay, yes, this is something that we could use if we're in competition. Okay, I'll keep going. So the appraisal gap language, and this leads with a kind of a warning to the buyer. So begins at line 28. Buyer has consulted with the buyer's lender before including this provision. So it's just imperative that a buyer has the discussion with their lender to find out if they can even use this provision. They need to have the funds available, liquid cash, to come to closing if this gap, if a gap does need to be covered. So if we include language that a buyer can cover a gap, and then push comes to shove, they don't have the means, then we've put them in a really, really vulnerable position. So we need to make sure that buyers are definitely in the position to include an appraisal gap, and that's only after confirming with the lender if they are able to do that or not, okay? So I think that's what we definitely want you to hear first above anything with this language. Um, okay, so the way that this works, so starting at line 29, and you would include this appraisal gap language if you're including an appraisal contingency in the main body of the offer to purchase. Um, if the offer includes an appraisal contingency and the appraised value is less than the purchase price, the buyer agrees to cover the difference up to blank. And this is that appraisal gap number. So this could be, again, 5,000, this could be 10,000. If a buyer has $15,000 to spend and is willing to potentially cover a gap in appraisal up to that amount, you could do that. So what essentially the buyer is communicating to the seller with this provision is, and a lot of this came to light after, with, again, with the kind of the crazy competitive offer writing of like 2021, 2022, a lot of offers were going over asking, which was great for the seller, of course. But then what the sellers were really concerned about was the appraisals. Like, okay, that's great that you're giving me more money over asking, but we don't have the data to back up a lot of these offer prices, right? So until home values, like the history of the offer to purchase and final purchase amounts were logged, appraisers didn't have much to go back to and say like, and to justify all of these crazy offers over asking, right? So sellers wanted to start seeing, well, that's great that you're giving me all of this money over asking, but it might be meaningless if there's an appraisal contingency. So the buyer is communicating to the seller, you're right, and I'm committing to paying any difference up to this amount. So that's kind of the heart of, not kind of, that is the heart of the appraisal gap language. So buyer hereby represents the buyer has sufficient funds to cover the gap and amount financed in the financing commitment contingency. Buyer is hereby prohibited from sending a notice objecting to the appraised value unless the appraised value is lower than the purchase price minus the appraisal gap. So there are options for the buyer in terms of attempting to object to the appraised value or attempting to negotiate based off of an appraised value. But again, it has to be that purchase price minus what they wrote in on line 30. And then they have an ability to negotiate with the seller or serve a notice of defects. Again, these are going to be conversations with your buyer on what to put in on line 30 in terms of the gap. I think we haven't done it in a while, but Charlie was including kind of that data points, and Kimmy and Sarah Papp were, as they were reviewing opportunities, they were kind of marking for us what the average was of what people were putting in terms of the appraisal gap and the inspection threshold amounts. And I feel like at one time, like it was like an average of 17,000, which I thought was really high. But but again, it could range, again, 5,000 to 20,000, even more than that, so depending on the price point and depending on how much you're going over, that's another variable in this. If the seller has the right to cure the appraisal contingency in the offer, the seller may satisfy the contingency by delivering a written notice to the buyer, adjusting the purchase price to the value shown on the appraisal report plus the appraisal gap. All of the terms of the appraisal contingency remain the same. So that's just kind of outlining for the seller, if they do elect to cure, what they need to do. And they would send that written notice back to the buyer adjusting the purchase price. Okay, any questions on that? Okay. Good deal. Love it.
Yeah, I think in drafting that, as you said, but it has to be really stressed, that the buyer, with the buyer's agent, should check with the buyer's lender of the amount that the buyer can cover in that appraisal gap. Just can't come up with a number and put it in the addendum AC.
Right. And you know, it gives you as the agent a little bit of protection, knowing that that we consulted with the lender, because the lender has line of sight to their finances. So it's kind of more of a protection for us too.
Yes.
See why. Okay, the escalation clause. I feel like of the three, this is the one that has kind of come back into play or I've gotten questions about. Um, and you know, not a lot. I would say just maybe two or three in the last few months, but just, you know, enough to make a little bit of a trend for us, that escalation clauses are being used again. So the escalation clause, again, we're using this in a competitive situation. And the heart of this is that a buyer is saying, communicating to the seller, I'm going to offer you this amount. And if you receive another offer, over this amount, up to a max amount, I will pay you $1,000 more than that other offer that you received if it's higher. So kind of getting into the nuts and bolts of this. So if the seller accepts this offer and receives one or more additional bona fide offers to purchase the property with terms acceptable to the seller, no later than, and we have to put a date in here. So the buyer is saying, yes, I'll match and raise my amount of my offer if you get another offer, but I'm going to put a timestamp on that. You can't get that offer, can't come a week from now. It's got to come in within the next 24 hours. So that might be another, that might be a guideline that you use. Typically, what I see is that this date is matched with the binding acceptance date named in the offer to purchase, which is usually 24 to 48 hours. So it's not a long time. So it's basically saying to the seller, you've got 24 hours, and if you've got another offer, we'll match it. Or you can make it less than that too, you know, if you kind of want to be more aggressive, but we'll match it, but it can't be an offer that you have received beyond at this point. That's the crux of that. Which results in a net proceeds of sale, purchase price minus any monetary contributions by the seller, payable to seller equal to or greater than the net proceeds of sale, payable to the seller under this offer, then the purchase price of this offer shall automatically increase to an amount which generates net proceeds of sale to seller, and you're going to put in that incremental amount there, in excess of the highest net proceeds of sale generated in such other offers. Kind of, again, really wordy way of saying we'll beat your offer in this incremental amount named on line 40. So let's say $1,000. We'll beat your offer, we'll beat any other net offer by $1,000. And you need to show us this other offer and make sure that that you did not receive this offer beyond the date that we named on line 37. The purchase price of this offer may be increased once or more than once based on one or more other offers. So you're going to check mark which one here. The purchase price of this offer shall not exceed, and then this is where you're going to put in that buyer's max price. So this doesn't just it's not a free for all. The buyer is going to identify, okay, I'm going to put in an offer of $200,000, but I'm only willing to go up to 225. So that's where you're going to put in on line 44, that 225 number. If the purchase price of this offer is increased based on one or more other offers, the seller shall, no later than blank days after receipt of said other offers, submit to buyer a signed amendment to the offer reflecting the adjusted purchase price and a copy of any other offers that resulted in and were the basis for the increase to the purchase of this offer. The original purchase price remains the same if seller does not provide the amendment. Seller or their attorney shall send a bona fide other offer to buyer's email address at blank. So this is where you as the buyer's agent would include the buyer's email address. And again, this is to address and send the amendment or the evidence that the seller did receive another offer, and the seller needs to send that offer directly to the buyer. We are prohibited from sharing this based off of our license ethics, based off of confidentiality. We cannot share the terms of another offer with another buyer, but that's not to say a seller can not. So a seller now needs to send that buyer a copy of the other offer showing that this, in fact, did bump your offer up. I want to go back to the purchase price. Okay, bumping once or more than once. So this is where, in the escalation clause, now this is where it gets muddy. And buyers and sellers have an opportunity to bump these prices either once or more than once. And this is where, again, we kind of get the most questions depending on the amount of other offers, the amount of other offers with escalation clauses, and if they are varied in terms of whether or not the purchase price can increase once or more than once. So it's more beneficial to a seller to check mark that the offer may be increased more than once. So if anything, if you want to have an understanding of what would put your buyer, give a seller or buyer a more competitive advantage, it would be that you would want to mark that the purchase price could be increased more than once. If a buyer is just kind of like, I'm willing to do this, but I'm not willing to let it keep bumping up, then you would just check mark once. So that means that if there was another offer that came in, the buyer is essentially saying, I'm only willing to go up that one time, not multiple times, as I do have the option. We're going to go over some examples of this in a minute. I'll give you guys some examples of what that looks like. So if choosing to exercise an escalation clause, the offer is simply accepted and evidence of the other offer is delivered to the buyer after an accepted offer. So we get this question a lot, actually. So if the purchase price does end up changing based off of an escalation clause, we often will get the question, should we counter the offer back with the new price? And no, you're not. The intention is that you are accepting, the seller is accepting that offer as it is, assuming all of the other terms are acceptable to the seller. And then after the accepted offer, that's when the seller now is going to communicate with the buyer directly, showing them a copy of the other offer, and then that amendment to the offer to purchase, raising the purchase price because it got escalated, will then be executed. The seller's side should initiate the amendment to change the price. And it's stated right in the provision that the buyer must deliver the amendment back by the deadline. So that seller's got 2 days to get that amendment over to the seller's side, has 2 days to get that amendment over to the buyer. And we used to get this question a lot, like, what happens if the buyer just sits on that amendment and doesn't sign it? Which was the case before this addendum AC was drafted. They would just
Wait,
send it back. Yeah, they would just wait. But now it's stated right in the provision that the buyer must deliver it back, which was helpful for us. Um, Buyer's agents call listing agents ahead of time. Listing agents have conversations with the seller about escalation clauses ahead of time. So I think the reason why we included these comments, not all listing agents were fans of escalation clauses. A lot of listing agents were like, we just want your highest and best. My seller does not want to mess around with an escalation clause. So as buyer's agents, we want to just make sure that we're communicating with the listing agents and if it would even be agreeable to a seller to receive an offer with an escalation clause. And what we have come to find out is like listing agents, it wasn't really necessarily the sellers that were having issues with it. It was just listing agents were having a tough time with how to explain it. And I think it's a lot more commonplace now. But still, I would definitely make the ask of a listing agent, is this something that would even be entertained, you know? And then listing agents having conversations with sellers ahead of receiving offers, at the time of a listing. If you think it's going to be something that's going to be pretty hot, I would definitely have a conversation with your sellers on what an offer, what potential offers could look like. So those are just kind of tips for you guys. This is from an attorney and the WRA. Areas of concern as it relates to the escalation clause. Okay, I should say, there was no standard form or language. There was issues around clarity, juggling multiple offers with escalation clauses, the math involved, and inflated value and appraised value. So these were the things that they were trying to head off by creating the addendum A. There are still issues, I would say, with math
yes.
and with juggling multiple offers with the escalation clauses.
Agents, when they call me, in this situation where they have multiple offers with escalation clauses, one of the things I bring up to sort of wipe the slate clean and start over is to use a multiple, counteroffer with
Yeah.
multiple people who are writing the escalation clauses. It's much clearer and much simpler to just turn around and deny the escalation clause and say that to each party who wrote one, they're going to counter their offer with a certain price or other terms or whatever. It is a good way, and I know several really top agents do that. They don't want to get into the mess of doing the math and doing all of this and just straight come back with a multiple counteroffer. The other thing I want to mention, and maybe Steph's probably a lot nicer than I am, but I I won't do the math for you. A lot of agents will say, I've got these three escalation offers, and this one goes up to this, and this one goes up to this, and this one goes up to this, and what should I do? I'm going, get a pencil with an eraser on it and you figure the math out. Because I think it's something that you should be able to understand enough to do the math, to go back to your seller to be able to explain it. Or you should be able to know it well enough to do the math to explain to your buyer what that means. If we're not here just to give you the answers, we're here to explain how it's done. So those are my 2 points.
I think what I've done, I haven't done it for somebody, but like somebody will come to me and say like, okay, this is the scenario, this is the number I came up with, and kind of just double checking our process.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's a good point though. I mean, we have to understand how this works.
Right. Yeah, I think that's fine if they're attempting to, say this is what I came up with. What do you think? That's
Yeah.
fine. But to just call Steph or me and say, figure it out.
Right.
tell me what to write.
Too much pressure.
Yeah. Oh,
Okay, so here's an example of a possible scenario with adjusting, a purchase price only once, and an offer that adjusts more than once. So we've got offer one is 235. We've got an escalation of $1,000 over the highest offer, up to a max of 243, and they can adjust only once. Offer two is 240 and it has no escalation clause. Offer three is 239, has an escalation increment of $500 over the highest offer, up to a max of 242, can adjust more than once. I think we got these again directly from
Ori.
Corey or Carol, I think, on this one, on these
Yeah.
ones. But, so the highest offer of the three on its face is 240,000. To maximize the sale price, we would take the $500 from offer three to get an offer price of 240,500. Then we're gonna take the $1,000 from offer one to get the 241,500. And because offer three allowed for adjusting the purchase price more than once, we can use that $500 again. And we can add another $500 from offer three to get 242 for the highest price. This is just an example to show you just how, again, kind of complex it can be. And will help you double check work. But like this is just to show you again that you've got to use all three offers. All three offers can come into play. And I think we even have a slide coming up with a way to combat that, and that was Joni's comments before on doing a multiple counter offer. But another example, so offer number one, initial price of 160 with an escalation of 10,000 and can bump once. The max price is 190. In offer number two, there's an initial purchase price of 167.5 with an escalation increment of 5,000 and can bump more than once, max price of 185. Offer number one turns into a potential purchase price of 177.5 by taking that $10,000 increment and adding it to the 167.5 of offer number two. Now, offer number two now may add $5,000 to get 177.5 for a final purchase price of 182.5, because offer number two again indicated that the offer may be bumped more than once. And because offer number two and that 182.5 did not exceed this 185, so they're just saying that offer number two is basically saying you can bump as many times as it allows, but we are not going to go up past that 185. Now, that 190 purchase price and can only bump once, you can kind of see now how that offer number one, I mean, this looked better because it was a max price of 190 and an escalation of 10,000, but really it was offer number two that won out because you could bump it more than once. So this is more of an example to show you that it might be in your buyer's best interest to include that they can bump more than once. Okay, and it's still, I'm gonna go back, it will still only, what's nice about this is that it still, gives that max price. It's never gonna go beyond that. So your buyer is protected in that sense. But back to Joni's point. So the best response though might be to use a multiple counter offer. So you're going to counter out those escalation clauses. You could counter each offer to the highest price of 243. You can also address the other terms of offers. So maybe, again, it might be the case where you've got multiple offers that are pretty similar and just like could need a slight tweak of different provisions. And you might need to use a counter offer anyway. So it just might be a better tool to use a multiple counter situation. And you know what? This is giving me an idea that we should probably go over multiple counters next month.
Good point.
And it's nice for sellers because the seller gets another chance to choose from any buyer responding. So just like in a quick nutshell, how that works is that a buyer, or so excuse me, a seller can respond to all of those offers that came in, and not just the ones with escalation clauses, but all of them. And they're essentially saying like, okay, this I'm gonna counter this to make it an offer that I want to see to buyer number one. Same with buyer number two, same with buyer number three, and then that all goes out to those buyers, and the buyers have an understanding that multiple counter offers have gone out, excuse me. And a buyer then has a chance to counter that offer and come higher, you know. If the buyers just end up all accepting the multiple counter offer that the sellers came back with, then all three of those come back to a seller, and now a seller gets to choose which one they like the best. So it really is nice for your sellers to use a multiple counter offer. And it just cleans it up. I think that's why we kind of push that. There is no confusion, kind of going back to this example over here, that seller with these could multiple counter both of these guys and just say, I want you to pay 190. Offer number two, I've got an offer over here of 190. I want you to pay 190 as well. So it's just another tool to use, but also just clears up confusion when there's so many different scenarios. Can be clear as mud. Come to compliance for help if there are questions. So it's a good addendum. We were using it for a lot there for quite a bit. I'm using it often for many months after it was introduced. And like I said, especially with the escalation clause, I've been seeing that more. And in spring, it will probably get competitive again. So we just want you to know that it exists and make sure that you guys know that it's a tool in your toolbox. Are there any questions? Okay, thanks for sticking with us.
Yeah, and I will add multiple counteroffer to a topic next month.
Cool.
So I think that's a good call.
Yeah, it gets confusing. Okay, thanks everybody. We'll see you next week.
Yep.
Oh,